Hello, I'm here with a presentation on dry needling in the treatment of myofascial trigger points. This is part of my assessment for the unit of Epidemiology and Principles of Research at the University of Canberra, so let's begin. I'll start by giving an overview of what I plan to talk about. So first I plan to explain a bit about what dry needling is, how it works. I also want to talk about why I actually chose it and my reasons for investigating it as an intervention. I'd like to discuss how I searched for evidence on dry needling as a suitable intervention, the level of evidence I was able to find, the quality of that evidence, and then I'll discuss some of the biases I feel present in the studies that I ended up looking at. I'll also obviously go over the results of those studies and list the reported outcomes, and also then give a summary of what lessons I feel those studies have given me, as well as what we should look at going in future studies into dry needling. So just going into some of the reasons I chose to look at dry needling and some of the advantages I feel it offers. So my background discipline is in physiotherapy, so obviously this is a physiotherapy intervention. It doesn't rely on medications. It's potentially less costly because of that. You don't need to pay for long-term medication regimes, assuming that you're just using the dry needling to treat the pain and nothing else. It tends to be less physically demanding on the therapist. Some of the soft tissue therapies and massages that we normally use to release trigger points can be quite demanding. The patient tends to experience relief quickly, and you'll see in a video in a bit how quickly that is. And it also, so for example, if I'm trying to massage the trigger points out of a ITB, that tends to take a while, and it's normally a bit discomforting to the patient when I'm actually pressing on those trigger points trying to get them to release. It treats the underlying cause of pain rather than trying to dope people up over the pain. And foremost for me, probably, it's just very interesting, it's weird, and I think that's just very fun to look at. So this is just a short video I have of some dry needling being performed in a physiotherapy clinic in America.
Demonstrate how we perform trigger point dry needling to the levator scapular muscle. The first thing we do is we position the arm behind the back. That helps position the shoulder blade so that the levator scapular muscle is more towards the surface. Next, I'm going to feel with my fingers and try and find the trigger point in the muscle. The trigger point will feel like a thickened area in the muscle, and it may be tender for the patient. Once I find that trigger point, I'm going to take this very small acupuncture needle, very thin. There's the trigger point there. And just tap the needle into the trigger point. And next, I'm going to move the needle around, move it up and down, to try and find more little trigger points within the trigger point. And what I'm looking for is for the muscle to jump. When I feel that muscle jump, I know I'm in the trigger point. And once I feel like I've released the trigger point, I withdraw the needle, and we're done.
So there you have it, no muss, no fuss. It was done and dusted fairly quickly. There wasn't any twitching or verbal complaints from the patient, so it didn't seem to be very painful for them. And importantly, the clinician was also able to feel the needle doing something. It was able to feel the muscle actually jumping in response to the needle and then releasing the trigger point. So now I'm going to talk a bit about how I went looking for evidence. Obviously I started at first with the Cochrane database because I was looking for systematic reviews. I didn't find any in the Cochrane, unfortunately. I then moved to PubMed, which has a much larger database, and started looking for systematic analysis there and randomized controlled trials. I wanted the results to be relatively recent, so for the last 5 years. I needed to have placebo controls included. That was a big thing for me, and I also wanted an accepted measure of treatment outcomes just so I could actually compare the results from one study over another and say this is the type of pattern that we're consistently seeing. So looking at the level and quality of the evidence I was able to find, the systematic analysis used several studies focusing on back and neck pain. Some of these studies were a bit old, but they did include placebo controls in all cases, which was very good, and overall probably labelled this as an NHMRC hierarchy of evidence level 1. The randomized controlled trials, one of them looked at myofascial pain syndrome, which may actually be different to just looking at myofascial trigger points or myofascial trigger point pain. and the blinding protocols I'll go into a bit later, but overall they did all include placebo controls, and I felt they had a very good design. All of these used the VAS scores, which made it very good to compare between them, and the randomized control trials would probably be at NHMRC hierarchy of evidence level 2. In all of these cases, there was a relatively small sample size. One of the randomized control trial only had n equals 39 and n equals about 50 for the other one. The concern here is that when you divide that between the treatment groups of the dry needling and the sham needling, that's only about 20 people each, which isn't great. The systematic analysis also notes that about 50 to 100 was the range of sample for the studies used in meta-analysis, but some of these included additional treatment groups like lidocaine in addition to dry needling and sham needling or placebo. So depending on how many treatment groups, you end up dividing those people by quite a lot, and it becomes far less valid to make inferences about the patient outcomes. So looking at the samples of bias, the systematic analysis, I feel that the authors really don't address this particular issue, but they excluded studies from meta-analysis if they weren't able to find a difference between dry needling and other therapies. So immediately my concern there is, if a study accepted the null hypothesis, that is that dry needling is not effective or not different to other therapies, then immediately they've shot the null hypothesis a bit in the foot for their own meta-analysis. They do also report a language bias, but I don't really feel this is strictly relevant, so they excluded non-English papers. Critical reasoning is probably going to be a universal language, as is muscle pain, so I don't feel that's necessarily important. The randomized control trial displayed significant gender bias. There were 45 females to 7 males. Again, they were assigned by random number generator, and unless there's like a significant difference to how females respond to dry needling to males, then there's not really going to be much of a difference in the underlying cause, but there could well be, we don't know at this stage. The placebo and the sham needling placebo and the dry needling treatments themselves had the same administrator, so the concern there is the administrator is not blind to the treatment group of the patient. Obviously that's quite hard to do because of the nature of the therapy. A sham needling therapist is going to know that they're doing the sham needling, but the key here is that non-verbal cues from the clinician may impact whether the patient thinks the treatment is going to work. And the second randomized control trial, it also had the same issue, same administrator for sham and proper therapy. So the outcome measures reported in most cases were improved VAS scores. There were typically improved VAS scores for both the sham needling and dry needling groups after treatment, compared with before treatment, but into comparison showed better VAS scores improvements with the treatment group. One of the randomized control trials also included a quality of life score, and that also improved for the treatment group. So findings and recommendations. Overall, after looking at these studies, I would conclude that there is enough evidence to say that dry needling does tend to produce significantly better outcomes than sham needling. There was also improved patient quality of life in one study. This was the study with a small sample size, so I'm not sure how much reach that has in terms of blanket statements, that this also produces better quality of life in patients. Future studies should really look at determining the underlying mechanism, how dry needling actually forces that trigger point to relax, and also the fact that VAS scores improved in the sham needling groups demonstrates that the placebo effect is very important, and it's very important to get that locked down. And also future studies really need to try to have a larger sample size in order to make some much better inferences of the data. So this is just a list of all my sources, and thank you very much for your time.